I know you're early in your investigation, but I just need to tell you, I think there's 3 people involved.
Oh, wow.
The psychic told me that, and we keep seeing the number 3 in different places. And she wasn't wrong.
Man found dead over the random attack.
About a spike in domestic violence.
Hey Dave, how's it going?
Nicole, how are you?
I am doing really well. I've been really excited about this particular episode since we started planning this podcast.
Yeah.
I think because you and I really share a belief that once someone has passed, there are affirmations and signs that can assure us that they're still with us in a myriad of ways. It doesn't mean you need to go looking for signs necessarily, but you just kind of need to be in tune and recognize when they come.
That's right.
And it can be a really comforting thing, right? So as we know and have now learned, you've experienced death on a pretty deep level, I would say. You've been on the scene right after something has happened. You've visited morgues to find out further about, to move an investigation along, get some evidence. So you've seen a lot of dead bodies. And so you're no stranger to death, to this whole death thing. And as is a common thread with many of our episodes, there's definitely a sense of curiosity, likely because the average person, myself, many of our viewers and listeners, haven't really dealt with death on almost a daily basis, kind of like you have. So you have a really different perspective. And we're going to talk about, what happens to a body physically when you die, and then kind of go beyond that and things you can look for in a positive way. So why don't we start off and talk about your body. Once your heart stops beating, what happens?
Well, I mean, immediately after death, when our heart stops beating, our brain ceases to function. And we begin the process of dying. And death is a process. Within the first hours of death, the body will start to cool about 1.8 degrees Celsius an hour. And as that is occurring, something else is occurring in the body as well. The blood in our body that was being pumped by our heart will begin to pool now because our heart's no longer pumping.
Right.
And that pooling is called lividity. Interestingly, lividity, what it looks like, it's like a discoloration really on the skin. So if you were to pass on your back, you will get that discoloration on your back because, of course, gravity pulls the blood,
right,
to where it's supposed to be. Lividity is one of the things that an investigator can use to determine whether or not a body has been moved or not, because if the lividity doesn't match
their placement,
their placement or their position, we know that the body's been moved at some point in time, and that somebody could be involved in their death. And so, but this process of lividity occurs. And the other thing interesting about a lividity is it happens fairly early on, like within 6 hours-ish.
Okay.
And I'll always say ish, because when it comes to moving through the process of death, it's not the same for every person.
Yes, and I would imagine the manner in which they died also plays a big factor in the timing of things.
And temperature in the room.
Right.
And
so many factors.
There's a lot of factors.
Yeah.
And so it's whether the person was septic or had like an infection in their body at the time of their passing, all of these will affect sort of the rate that we move through death's process. But when it comes to lividity, one of the things that we do get challenged with sometimes, or what I used to be challenged with at points, was a family member might mistake lividity for something like bruising.
Right.
And so they might
think it can appear that way.
Yes, and they might look to them more nefarious than it actually is, when it's actually a process of the death
Naturally.
itself.
Yeah.
And so that has to be sort of provided as an explanation sometimes.
Right.
And then after that occurs, our bodies go into something called rigor mortis, but that's that stiffness. And that usually happens in and around that 8-hour-ish range. And that is a chemical reaction that's occurring within the body that causes that stiffness.
Okay.
And it dissipates. After 24 hours, the stiffness goes away.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I was always under the impression that once a body hardens, it stays that way.
No. Yeah.
But
so
that
it does.
answers a lot of questions.
Yeah, it just sort of
Right.
releases.
Right.
And then what will happen is then the body will start to build up bacteria. The bacteria in the body, they already exist.
Yeah.
Will start to produce gases.
Okay.
And those gases will, if the person hasn't been found, those gases will start to produce bloating, I guess, would be
Right.
the best way to describe it.
Yeah.
And this is often a time when police will discover bodies. If someone has passed alone and nobody has gone to check on them for a few days, a neighbor might call in an odor or a foul odor. This is because that person has made it to that phase or stage of the death
Just
process.
gets stronger and
That's right.
stronger.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then from there, our body continues to would deteriorate to a point where we eventually become a skeleton.
Right.
And that is really what death's process is. And it isn't, despite what we see on TV, we've all watched those detective shows where like the detective walks in with the coroner
Yeah.
or with the medical examiner and lifts the arm and drops the arm or,
Yeah.
Yeah. Says this person's been dead for X number of hours.
Right. Right.
It's impossible.
But speaking of which, quickly, what is the difference between a coroner and a medical examiner?
Oh yeah, great. So it really depends on what region of the world you're living in.
Okay.
So there's sort of two systems, the coroner system, the medical examiner system.
Yeah.
I'm very familiar with the medical examiner system.
Yeah.
I'm not so familiar with the coroner system. But from a layman's perspective, typically the coroner is not necessarily the person that's going to do the examination of the body proper.
I see.
They're going to be the person that the medical examiner reports to, and then they're the ones that are going to issue the manner and the cause of death.
I see. Okay.
Some regions of the world, the coroner can be actually an elected position. And then in Canada, I think it's not an elected position, but some provinces do have coroner system, some have the medical examiner system. The medical examiner system, the person that does the examination of the body is also the one that's going to issue the manner and cause of death.
Right. Right.
And so coroners are to follow the recommendation of the medical examiner. But in elected scenarios, arguably, there have been examples where maybe the coroner has gone against what the medical examiner is reporting.
Of course. Yeah. Yeah.
So,
And then as far as the more goes, so like, because I'm envisioning the freezing and the refrigeration of bodies and all of that. So that just like delays the process so that they can actually have more time to examine?
Yeah. So
Okay.
once a body has been discovered,
Yeah.
then the body is, it really is, and it is like, bodies are brought into care, and I believe everybody that works within that industry really believes that too.
Of course, yeah.
I don't...
Dignity.
Absolutely, and it always has been handled that way. It was one of the first impressions I ever had.
Right.
When I worked...
That you noticed.
Yeah, I was not that I was surprised, because I would have no other expectation, but I was pleasantly pleased
Right.
to see that our loved ones
Yes.
are all treated in a dignified manner.
Yes.
And I think that's a real testament to those that work in the industry of death.
Yeah.
And, despite what people might think that, there's these like sort of backhanded jokes or, laughing at someone's expense, never,
No.
on my word, did I ever see anything like that.
Yeah.
It wasn't, these weren't things to joke about or to laugh about,
Yeah.
with someone's loved one. And people were always treated that way. They were patients,
Yeah.
really.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just in a different sort of
Different
way
state.
form of care.
Yeah.
And then, so then once we're turned into skeletons, that's sort of it. There's things that can move us along in that process.
Right. But eventually it's just we're kind of turned to dust and returned to the earth.
Yeah.
You know?
That is what...
Just how we came. Yeah.
That's right. That's what some people believe,
Right.
for sure.
Yeah. Well, and speaking of which, there are obviously varying levels of belief of what happens after death, and if there are if that person will be reincarnated in some way, shape, or form. Like, there's obviously so many unknowns, but as a society, we've picked up on different beliefs. And so there are a lot of things that we have kind of in common that, afterlife, it doesn't necessarily mean that that person has left us completely. And we can get something called affirmations.
That's right, we can. Before we go to affirmations, I'd love to I have a beautiful reincarnation story.
Oh, yeah.
That just touches on a little bit of what you were saying is around about the ideas of belief.
Yes.
There are people out there that are going to be listening to this today, and they're going to be like, well, I don't believe in anything.
Right.
Okay, but that's a belief too. Just remember that.
Yeah, right. Not believing is believing.
Right.
That you're not believing in something.
Whether you believe in something or nothing at all, it's not my business.
Yeah.
What I came to learn through my exposure to families that were grieving and looking for signs and affirmations and things of that nature was that the most important thing is that if it brought them comfort or peace, who am I to shatter that?
Agree. Yeah.
And so and by having that attitude, I was exposed to so many amazing individuals and families who shared with me what they believed was happening. And I had a case once where a family, most people, I think, in Western society sort of believe in this idea that there's a utopia and a really, fiery hot place called hell.
For the bad guys.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that's sort of a traditional, mostly because in Western society. But, there are obviously we are diverse in our beliefs, and with that diversity comes others as well that are maybe not thought of as much in Western culture. And one of them is this idea around reincarnation.
Yeah.
Well, I'll tell you why the beautiful piece about belief is. This story begins with a young woman who's killed by an intimate partner. She's early in her life, like she's 22, 23 years of age.
Okay.
So there's a boy that just couldn't let her go, didn't recognize that, that's the best way to love her was to just to let her go.
Right.
And so he made this terrible decision to take her life and did so, left the family devastated. A really wonderful, beautiful family whose faith was centered around the idea that when we die, we were reincarnated, recycled, really, back into the world.
Yeah.
And that was their hope for their daughter, that this would actually happen at some point in time.
Right.
And I remember, hearing about it and being to the service and hearing more about it sort of through the eulogies and the sermons that were being sort of delivered and thinking this is an interesting concept to me because it's not something I was necessarily exposed to before.
Right.
6 months has gone by and the father of this story, a wonderful man, calls me and says, Dave, I got to meet you for coffee. Something amazing happened. And I said, okay, let's go. And so off to the coffee shop I went, and he's already there early, eager to tell me, gets me to the table, we order our coffee, and he says, you won't believe this, but my daughter, she came to me last night in a dream. She's been born again. She's a baby wrapped in a blanket. I saw her. I know it's her.
Wow.
The only thing I don't know is I don't know where she is.
Where? Right.
And I said, well, that's amazing. Like, fantastic.
Yeah.
And this is the part that was so important about his belief. He knew that he was going to have to live another 20 to 25 years of this life to give an opportunity to be reunited and reacquainted with this daughter, her soul, her spirit that he so desperately missed.
Yeah.
You see, he knew that even though she was a baby wrapped in a blanket today, that she was going to grow from that.
Right.
She was going to grow into a young woman who would eventually have access to planes, trains, and automobiles.
Right.
And be able to sort of globe-trot around the world.
When she comes of age. Yeah. Right.
And that would take 20, 25 years. So he was going to wait for that.
Wow. Yeah.
So his belief around reincarnation and what it was going on with his daughter is giving them the reason the reason to continue life today.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that's beautiful.
Yeah.
Part of belief.
Definitely. And even just that reunion in other faiths is what kind of drives you forward, is that you'll meet again, right? If that's what you believe.
You're right.
That is something to look forward to, and it's not gone forever.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's right.
That's really powerful.
Yeah, yeah.
And it kind of reminds me of like if like a heart transplant patient or something like that, and the family wants to reunite with the family who donated it. Like there's this innate connection with that family just throughout that process too, because you kind of get that piece of your loved one that is still here with you and in some kind of like tangible form.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I definitely think that, faith-based religions aside, there's other things that, some people like look to for affirmation.
Yeah. Yeah.
And,
Let's talk about that.
Yeah. Do you have anything that you've ever had happen in your life where you're like...
Yeah, well, I, as many of you know, have a background in broadcasting and journalism. So I was doing one of my final projects in school, and I decided to do it on a clairvoyant in the city, because I thought that would be of interest to a lot of viewers and just to myself as well.
Sure.
I've always been really curious about that. So I had my mom as the subject.
Yeah.
And so we went and filmed and entered this woman's home. And immediately it was like she was flooded with information. And she thought, we need to start this right now because I have a lot to share. So we're like, okay. And my mom and I are kind of cautiously going into this because you don't want to sell yourself short, but at the same time, like you want to see what's happening. You don't want to give away too much in case she's going to use that as a piece to convince you. But so she ended up being, I guess, so my mother's father passed when she was only 9 years old. He was a train conductor. And I mean, the unfortunate thing is that he wasn't supposed to be working that shift. Another coworker had asked him if he could cover. He said yes. Fast forward a couple hours, he said, actually, you know what? I can work, but my grandfather had already committed. He said, don't worry, I've already made the plans, so I'll take this shift. So anyway, off he went on his trip. And unfortunately, there was this tragic derailment and he lost his life. My mom was only 9. But she remembers as a young 9-year-old at his funeral, and at the time it was an open casket and the wake and everything. Mm-hmm. So she remembers kind of like peeking up over the coffin and moving the pillow slightly and seeing a lot of damage done to his neck. So they knew that was likely how he passed. But I guess, so this clairvoyant was able to bring him forward. His name was Marcien. So she said, there's somebody that's a father figure. And then the letter M is coming to mind. Wow. So obviously my mom's like, possibly my dad, and she said, he's pointing to his neck. So after she heard that, my mom thought, oh, okay, yeah, because she remembers obviously what she saw. That's never left her. And she said, after all of these years of, the family wondering if he knew what was coming, if he was in pain, how he passed, he wants you to know that he didn't know it was coming. It was instant, it was fast, it was painless. And so that alone was very reassuring to my mom. And it was a beautiful experience.
And that's what I love about when we think about affirmation. Mm-hmm. And some people do, from my experience too, people have sought that through like a clairvoyant or a psychic, right?
Yeah.
To try and reconnect with a loved one.
It's a huge business.
Oh, huge.
Yeah.
It kind of reminds me of something that a death doula.
Yes. Yeah.
By the name of Sarah Kerr. I've read a little bit about her at different points, and she said once, there's an intimacy to being part of when someone passes or when someone dies, and I would agree with that.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
But she also talks about the veil being very, very thin.
Yes.
Between our world and theirs, and so psychics, of course, are this idea of sort of passing through this sort of thin veil.
Yes.
I had a family, and I don't want to butcher the story, and we're talking generalities here, but they shared a story with me that I thought was amazing too, that really touches on this point of sort of the veil and the thinness of it.
Yeah.
And it's a story of Well, it's a story of a woman who is dementious. In the late stages of her life, she's dementious. She had 3 sons.
Okay.
And the sons would go to her care facility on the weekends and visit with her. And every time they went, she was always hosting a party in this garden. And in the garden at this party, it was in the 1940s, is what her mind had kind of created.
Okay.
Had all these family members that had passed before her.
Oh, wow.
Well, while she was in care and while she was dementious, one of the brothers in this story dies.
Okay.
And the other brother wonders, well, when I go to see mom next, how am I going to explain this to her?
Wow.
And so with a bit of trepidation, I believe, he shows up that weekend to let her know that your son has passed away. You've lived beyond him. And when, she's back in the garden in the 1940s, and guess who's visiting for the first time ever?
I know. Right. Wow. Crazy.
And it's just a beautiful reflection of, I think, again, this idea that maybe the veil is a little bit thinner than what we think.
Yeah.
And maybe even people who are at the end of their life
Yeah. Yeah.
are getting
They're closer
to
to
it than
Yeah.
we would ever know.
Yeah. It's kind of like if you've lost a child,
Yeah.
even during pregnancy, miscarried, but then you have another child, which they often refer to as rainbow children, but how they've kind of met on the other side already.
Oh, wow.
Because there's like that crossover, right?
That's beautiful.
Yeah. So they talk about that with the thinly veil as well. So it's like, oh, you knew him because you guys have already been on that side together,
Yeah.
and now you're Earth side here with me. So
Yeah.
it's pretty cool.
It is. And I mean, this is the thing with, again, like belief, affirmation, all of those things. Some of the common ones that, people had shared with me in the past, and, belief around butterflies, bees.
Butterflies, yeah. Birds. Yeah, yeah.
Robins mean something to me.
Yes, yeah.
And, I think we all have in our family maybe something that reminds us or brings us all together.
Yeah, yeah.
And robins is one for me. Bees is another.
Bees, that's right.
And repeating numbers
Right.
is another one where, I've had families tell me, actually I had one family who lost a son and a brother to a very random vicious attack.
Okay.
And when I went to go visit with them, they had done the psychic thing,
Okay.
but they were also getting the number of repeating numbers. And then the repeating number they kept getting was 3. And I remember sitting with the sister on the front stoop of the house, and she said, I know you're early in your investigation, but I just need to tell you, I think there's 3 people involved.
Oh, wow.
The psychic told me that, and we keep seeing the number 3 in different places. And she wasn't wrong. And actually, what was even crazier about it is she said, 2 of the 3, one of the 3 is more like a victim than an accused. Well, the third was the wife of one of the offenders.
Okay.
And I think she was in a very, very tumultuous relationship with him.
And somehow involved.
And but was witness to the murder as well.
Right.
All of this, I remember it just sort of sending this sort of shiver up my spine, like,
Yeah,
oh my
of course.
gosh, you knew.
And whether or not you believe in clairvoyance and getting messages from the other side, it's almost like taking a placebo. If that helps you and if it's bringing you peace, then that's all the purpose of all of it is that you can find that peace.
It's so true. I lost my father back in 2017 by cancer. And so, I mean, it was his passing was a little bit slower. We were fortunate as a family because we all got to spend time with him and express to him what we wished.
You knew he was near end of life.
Yeah. And I always wondered like whether or not I would ever see him again, feel him again, if these affirmations could come about. And on one strange day, about a year after he passed away, only once, did I think I had that possibility. And I had been out at my acreage, and I was cutting down some trees. I was out there by myself, and I had my chainsaw that I had just bought and was very proud of. And as I'm as I'm cutting down and notching this tree the right way, you notch it this way and notch it this way and you cut it this way so it falls this way, and you'll be safe.
Right.
And I just finished doing sort of one of the final notches. I put the chainsaw down for a moment, just getting ready to fall the tree. And a little honeybee landed on my chainsaw. And this is out in the middle of the bush.
Right.
In April, and it's cool.
Yeah,
and
not
honeybees,
typical.
no, and they're not supposed to fly. And why this was more significant to me was my family on the weekends were hobbyists, beekeeping hobbyists.
Oh, okay.
They actually produce their own honey.
Okay.
And so I saw it and I thought, oh, isn't that strange? And I remember wiping the little honeybee off the chainsaw, making that final cut. And that bloody tree, I'll never forget. It starts to fall the way it's supposed to, hangs up on the bough of another tree and kicks back on me.
Wow.
I'm running for the hills.
Right.
Smashed my brand new chainsaw.
Oh my God.
And almost broke my wrist. And I thought, okay, well, that was definitely a sign.
Right.
And I never went and cut another tree from that property.
Wow.
But, and it was neat. But then what was more miraculous about it all is I'm driving home that day, still kind of wondering what this bee was and could it have represented something.
Yeah.
And I've taken
trying to
it
find
on
the meaning and everything.
and I've decided it meant something.
Yes.
And that affirmation was confirmed when I'm driving home, and one of his colleagues calls me and says, I think your dad's trying to come through to me today. See, in the fall before he passed, he had given her from her garden, or his garden, a number of plants and things of that nature. And, up on out of 3 inches of ice in her backyard, one of these plants, I don't know if it was an onion stalk or a tulip, has broken through the ice on the same day that the bee had landed on my chainsaw.
What are the chances?
And she says, I think that's him coming through.
Wow. Yeah.
So if you follow us,
so you obviously shared your previous story too from that day.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
If you follow us on our YouTube channel and some of the other platforms, I'll make sure that I have some pictures of that posted, the tulip coming through.
Well, and speaking of pictures, I know orbs that appear in pictures can also come into play. And I have an example of that too, before we kind of start to wrap up today. But I was out at my parents' place. So they live on this beautiful property out in Ontario, and it's lush and a lot of trees. And we go there every summer and spend a couple of weeks there with the kids. So we were taking a walk one day. They live in this beautiful old home. It was built in the late 1800s, believe it or not, and has been, renovated obviously throughout the years. But there's an area in the home where my dad has his office and his pictures of his parents that have passed, and that's mostly where we kind of we can go spend time there and kind of just soak in their memory a little bit. So we were out for a walk, and I was taking pictures of my dad and my two girls, just kind of walking by this big, beautiful tree they have in their front property. And so wouldn't you know it, I'm taking these pictures, and I'm like, no, there's an orb kind of following us around, and I'm trying to get a clear picture. But as I go back later that day, I realized that the orb is appearing right in front of his office where we keep all of those images. And it's doesn't matter what angle I'm turning and where the sun is, but this orb is there.
Oh, amazing.
And I'm like, that orb is hanging out right where, the pictures are on that shelf. So I thought they're here in some way or another.
Totally.
They never got to meet my kids, but, I'm like, I believe they know them obviously on another level, but I thought that was pretty evident of their presence.
Orbs, such a big one.
Yeah.
And people have seen them or have experienced them.
Yeah.
Absolutely interesting. Well, they really believe it.
Yeah.
And that's wonderful.
Yeah, exactly. Do you have a case in mind that you covered that kind of will help us lead into our kind of takeaway today?
Well, I do actually. So, something I came to learn is, we've talked a lot about belief and why it's important just to accept belief on some level, as long as it's not hurting people.
Yeah.
But I also think that it's important to know that if you choose to talk to the dead, know they may be talking back to you in different ways.
Yeah.
One of my practices was when I was involved in some of our missing persons investigations, I always ask moms, what do you think? I did it for a couple of reasons. One is I wanted to prepare them for the possibility of the worst.
Okay.
And I wanted to see how far along they were that way.
Right. Right.
And I wanted them to start to reconcile that it could
What
be.
stage they were in. Okay.
And more often than not, if I was asking about a missing persons investigation, we already believed that they were deceased,
Okay.
being in homicide. But moms would always share their perspective. And I don't think I ever had a mom say, oh, I think they're still alive. I think almost every mom knew in their heart of hearts their child had died.
Okay.
And moms just know.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I had a case years ago that involved a little girl and her mom that had gone missing. And for 3 weeks, we scoured looking for them. The person we believe was responsible was a roommate. Was since been convicted and is in jail for his crime
Okay.
or crimes. But in that investigation, we were monitoring. We had, there's a real interest as investigators. We need to share information to the family, but we need to know that what we're sharing to the family we're doing it for compassion reasons.
Right.
But we also need to know that's not going out to the larger world.
Makes sense.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's always important to just kind of touch base and look into Facebook accounts and that kind of stuff. And I was looking into a Facebook account of one of the relatives and happened to see that this is a Saturday night. By Friday, I had reconciled after 3 weeks of searching that I was going to be presenting the case as a no-body homicide to the Crown Prosecutor on Monday. Saturday, the aunt is now at a auction, or a silent auction, and she's drawn to this one painting or this one picture.
Okay.
And she keeps thinking, I don't know what it is about that picture, but it was a picture, painting of basically trees on a path with the
Okay.
mountains in behind.
Okay.
And it was an oil painting. And she's like, I'm going to bid on it. So she bids on it. And then she bids on it again. She bids on it again. She eventually wins it. And she posts her prize, I guess, on Facebook. The darndest thing happens. And again, it's difficult to describe for those listening. But the very following day, 24 hours after she posts that picture, I believe I'm standing on the same path.
No way.
In the same scene as depicted in the photo, in the
Right.
painting.
Right.
And it just really, really sort of shone a light on this whole thing on where I'm like, is that possible that the dead were paving a path or pointing us in a direction of a place to look?
Right.
Because just at the end of that path or at the end of that road is where we found them.
Wow.
So that in itself is just so beautiful to me.
So make sure you listen and
Yeah.
you pay attention to those signs and affirmations.
And know if you're talking to your dad,
Yeah.
that they may be talking back.
Totally. And I feel like you can feel that. There's a different energy
Yeah.
when you're really reaching out to them.
Yeah.
I'll often light candles and just kind of sit alone and try to remember moments from our past and just sit and feel and see what happens. And there's a different energy.
I do need to just say one thing about this whole, I love the way you described that. You're sitting, you're feeling, and you're vibing on it. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
One thing I have come to learn, nobody will be able to see those affirmations. Nobody will be able to see the clues if we live with anger. If you look into a pot of boiling water, you won't see the bottom.
Right.
But if the water is clear, and absent heat
yeah.
and
yeah.
anger,
Yeah. Yeah.
it's so much easier to see to the bottom of the pot.
Totally.
And so, that is something that has to happen I think, for us to be really connected that way, is to be able to quiet our minds and just be present and listen.
And listen, yeah. And, just if you're listening to this as a podcast, I urge you to also go check out our YouTube channel, because there are a lot of cases that Dave talks about that are very visual. And so he just shared an example of that image that the painting that the aunt
Yeah.
had purchased and where those bodies were found. And so we'll be able to share all of that on our YouTube channel as well.
Yes.
All right. Well, thank you so much for that
Oh,
super interesting episode today, Dave.
Yeah, I hope everyone feels inspired by it. I hope you have that opportunity to connect
Yeah.
if that's what you decide to do.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks.
Well, we hope you enjoyed today's episode of The Ride Along. And if you're interested in learning more about Dave's career and the lessons he learned throughout, now that he's on the other side of it, be sure to pick up a copy of his book that he co-wrote with Sarah Cades called Skeletons in My Closet. And keep an eye out for his new release, Undaunted, with Susan Forrest.
My mantra of leaving people better than you found them continues to be my driver. And I hope you're leaving this podcast today feeling inspired, informed, and inclined to live your dash. If you enjoyed today's podcast, please be sure to like and subscribe. And take care, everybody. Thanks for joining us on The Ride Along.